Advertising is not just about the economy overall. It's trying to figure out where things are going with the economy, with the ad industry, and getting there before the headlines catch up.
Every week, billions of dollars move across media platforms, quietly shaping what we see, what we're buying, and which businesses are winning or losing.
But a lot of the times, that signal is buried deep within the data, and it requires going in, pulling it out, and trying to figure out where the market is headed.
That is what Media Monitor is all about. Making sense of those shifts that are shaping advertising, media, and consumer behavior using real data, not guesswork.
Every episode, we're going to break down what's happening in the market. We're going to see what has happened, why it's happened, and ultimately what it matters for brands, advertisers, publishers, and figuring out where things are going.
Sometimes we're going to go deep into the numbers. Sometimes Sean and I are going to react to the news. And sometimes we're going to try to predict what's coming next.
But it's always going to be the same. We're always going to be reducing uncertainty and trying to make people, you, make smarter decisions about today and tomorrow.
So if you work in media, marketing, or advertising, or you simply want to understand how the industry works behind the scenes,
then this show, totally for you.
This is Media Monitor, powered by Guideline. Sean, welcome back. How's it going?
It's going okay. Long week.
Long week, but a short week.
Like long, short week, right? I'm
Exactly.
in America, so like we get the Monday off, but it really made up for it on the Tuesday through Friday. But we're here.
I think
excited
so
for
too.
some snow.
Yeah, you're out on the East Coast where you guys are going to get a ton of it.
I certainly hope so.
And we will just be sitting here in our cool 60-degree controlled San Francisco environment.
Consistently. 40 to 65. 40 to 65.
That's
and
right.
then like in August, just 40. I was out there in August one year and it was just frigid year round.
Yeah, you get used to it. But
Yeah, that's fair.
Sean, I am super excited to be here because we had big news in our industry this week. OpenAI made an announcement that they are formally going to begin testing ads on ChatGPT. And I think it's something we got to spend some time talking about. I have a lot of questions for you about your take. And I figured what we could do is start off by just talking a little bit about this and then dive into the numbers. So for those who aren't as familiar, OpenAI announced that they are going to be testing ads on their free and Go platforms. Go is a version of their ChatGPT platform that sold for $8. It had previously been available in India. They're bringing that to the US. So in the US now, we're going to have 4 versions, kind of that professional version, the $20 a month version, and then the ads will be on the free and the $8 a month versions. This to me represents a new era because this is a big change for them. We're going to get to see real time how this impacts digital advertising. And so what I'd love to do today is spend some time talking about how that has unfolded for other companies in our industry using Guideline data as kind of a look back and get your take on it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's all kind of a good summary. And I think just to kind of recap too for our listeners, I think the important thing to start is they were very explicit of like a very limited window of users in the US are going to see advertising to start. I think what we've seen historically is as ad products roll out, there tends to be a start here and then broaden over time. But for the focus for today, it's like, what is then, if we take kind of the 800 million monthly active users globally, most reports that I've seen, and again, it's tough because they don't necessarily publicly state it, but like I've seen like 20-ish% as like a midpoint that are US based only. So of that US based is then like, how many are then on that free or potentially future Go tier? And it looks like from like wide industry sources, might be like 80% are using ChatGPT for free or potentially Go in the near future. And so you're talking about, of that 800 million, a relatively small subset of folks to start in terms of like your baseline. So I think that kind of helps temper some expectations around What is this advertising? How will it grow? And I also saw an interesting report where we'll kind of wait and see that it seems like they're out in market today with kind of that Netflix model where they're actually, kind of initially tossing out like $60 CPMs, which is pretty high across the market. At least our data shows that like the overall digital marketplace, without getting into kind of the nuance of channels, is like more like $12. So you are talking a huge price differential relative to kind of the market. And then search CPMs are much, much lower. You could get some, depending on what you're doing, like 33 cents potentially. So they are definitely on the very high end of what they're offering to start, but we'll see where that goes from a pricing perspective.
Yeah. And I mean, I think they've got the eyeball. This is something that while they said they weren't going to do it, we all knew it was coming and now it's here. While we'll disclaim that, what we'll talk about today is really purely for kind of just different scenarios and kind of it's for fun, right?
Educated, but yet not explicitly any sort of advice. So just fun, just a fun fact-based scenario conversation.
Exactly. We had to take this moment in time to kind of take a look back at what this looked like for other companies. And so, I think we should kind of get into it, and I'll kick it over to you. I'd love to start with TikTok.
Yeah.
TikTok emerged, massive growth. Had some announcements this week as well. But, Sean, talk to us about how TikTok grew from an advertising perspective and what that trajectory looked like.
Yeah. So I think maybe to take a step back, I think the TikTok is potentially good framing to see where this thing could go. But to kind of start, one of the things that I kind of wanted to lay out was like, and I know that we kind of chatted a little bit about this, was, we wanted to take a stab at just kind of doing some kind of back of the napkin, fact-based kind of analysis of both what we think could happen in year one, but then also over the next couple of years is where could this thing grow? And again, just focused right now on like US potential, right? There's always there will be a time where all of a sudden there'll be an announcement that says, congratulations, we are now offering the same ad tiers in Europe. Congratulations, India. You now have kind of Go plus subscription tiers, ad tiers, et cetera, right? That's coming. But just from like a pure math perspective of what we know and understand, we want to kind of take a baseline for what's going on. So I want to kind of also then throw out, I've seen a bajillion different numbers and like some pretty wild projections for year one. So I just want to say, here's where my head's at of like a baseline for where this thing could go is for 2026, I am right now back of the napkin thinking that this is probably about a $3.1 billion opportunity in terms of ad revenue. And there's a couple reasons why. Number one, I think the idea that like somehow they're going to go from never selling ads to all of a sudden being a ad making machine is pretty wishful thinking. Right? I think we've seen the model time and time again. Amazon Prime, for all of the things that it does really well, took a little bit of time to scale. Even though they kind of opened it up and said, everyone now has ads, it takes kind of that mechanism and kind of just, where's the sales team? What's like as tactical as like, do you have go-to-market materials? How are you positioning yourself against other budgets in marketing, right? Like tactical stuff like that takes a little bit of time to get into a rhythm. Helping agencies and advertisers understand what is Gen AI search and why is it different than search, right? Those take times, and often just be like, here's what our product is. This is actually what an ad looks like. All of that hasn't yet been done, and we're already kind of into February. So
your take then is, yes, they've announced it, but there's a lot of foundational work that has to be done to activate it.
Yeah, for sure.
Explaining what it is, getting those partnerships installed, securing those sales contracts. There's kind of a runway that needs to kind of happen first.
Yeah, right. And like they have some of that element in place because they have been generating revenue off of users. So it's not like they don't have salespeople going out and kind of having conversations, but it is a bit of a different sell in terms of like figuring out how you position advertising. And all of that takes a little bit of time. Right. And so that's partly why we're thinking the 3.4. And it's more about like the rough math of what I highlighted at the top, right? If it's 80% of US based users are actively kind of doing some sort of like free version, what does that actually work with in terms of like a per prompt? And they were even very explicit that like, look, we don't even think we're going to monetize every prompt, but we kind of just said like, okay, fine. For the simplicity's sake, if we try to back into the amount of prompts that we think are going to be in the US on that tier in year one, what do we think is a reasonable number to back into? At a high level, we think maybe 4.9 billion, but that would be assuming that like they hit the ground running in the first quarter and are just selling ads like crazy. I think also they just also need to see what is supply in terms of like actually people prompting and seeing an ad, right? That's also one of the challenges too. They could have people banging down their door, which I've read is like advertisers are lining up to just throw money at this, but how many people are actually going to see it, right? So there are limitations on both ends that I think the 3.4 is in my humble opinion, a very fair baseline.
And you bring up something else that's important to mention, which is that where they can reliably guess that the user is under 18, they're not going to be serving ads.
They were very like, hey, we're going to kind of just take a while, do some contextual based analysis. Yeah, based on their announcement.
Well, this is what they've said, right? They've also said that they're not going to run ads alongside more sensitive topics. So there's a whole group of prompts that are going to be off the table. So you're right. All of a sudden, we're kind of whittling down.
Yeah.
And that's going to, between the runway to get there and the number of prompts that are monetizable.
For sure.
I think it's a good point that you bring up.
Yeah. Yeah. I have them on rare occasion. But yeah, like I think I just want to like level set because I think you're going to start to hear some astronomical numbers in like year one. And I think everyone has a reason as to what number they want to throw out there, right? Like I think there's a lot of eyeballs on this. And so there's going to be a lot of like strategy. If I put out this number, what does this do and help here? And so I just want to also, not that I want to be adding to that noise, but like our take is 3.4 bill. It's a hot take, maybe lukewarm. I don't know. But I have seen some bigger numbers than that. And I would just urge caution on just like, what is the reality of going out and selling an ad is just a legitimate limitation of any company. So yeah, so that's like year one.
And I think that's right. And, I jumped into it because I'm thinking about like the TikTok of it all and how big it could be. And so maybe what we do is we kind of frame this out in a few different scenarios. So something that is explosive like TikTok, something that kind of maybe moves and plateaus. And we'll kind of talk about a player that looked like that. And then we'll cap out with a first mover in a space and kind of talk about what it looks like to be categorically one of the first in a space. They're not the first in Gen AI ads, but, they're close. So that work for our
It does,
today?
Right? I think it's a helpful framing because it's like there's no model that exists that says this will be the growth rate of Gen AI search advertising, right? And it's also like what the products you're getting today from a Gen AI search, my guess, are going to look and feel a lot like a search ad to begin with. But there's no way it looks and feels like a search ad in 3 years from now, right? It's probably, there's also evolution in the market. So I think like trying to say this is our model and all of these things is kind of silly. And I think the scenario-based thing of like, here's the pluses or minuses of looking at it this way is a good place to start of just having people starting to think about it. And there will be people, smarter than me that are going to come out with more sophisticated stuff in time. We'll start to see some real numbers. So, I wouldn't take these as like, 100% true, more so of like, they're based on real data, our data that we're able to look back way historically, going back to as early as 2009, and are able to kind of take an informed approach that says, if we look at some of these curves, what seems reasonable for ChatGPT and kind of the overall, Gen AI search environment. So I think that setup's good.
And I think your comment about how the ad itself evolves and the appetite of a consumer for the different ad types is really going to help drive this. And we don't know what that looks like yet, right?
For sure.
I agree with you. I think this starts kind of like a search ad, but if it becomes something because another thing that Sam Altman has said is people trust ChatGPT and maintaining that trust is important, right? There's a comfortability level that evolves and these ads can become kind of more incorporated into the responses. They might become more expensive, right? If people get to that point, So I think there's a lot of different ways that this could play out. And I think without further ado, let's jump into our first scenario. So
TikTok to the moon.
To the moon.
Yeah. Yeah. So from kind of our first base analysis is like, we would highlight TikTok as like the extreme of what we think the upper bounds of growth by, say, 2030 could be for ChatGPT. Everything we'll talk about today is thinking about from 2026, Q1 of 2026 through Q4 of 2030, what does that growth look like, right? And so the baseline for all of 2026 for now is like what we had mentioned earlier, right? A little over, excuse me, a little over $3 billion, right? So 3.4 billion is kind of the baseline. In the TikTok scenario, you had an enormous amount of growth kind of coming out of the launch in the US that basically in the first year, kind of their comps was like 700%. Year 2 was like 400%. So they are kind of like this inverted hockey stick where the first couple of years are just these astronomical growth rates. And then over time, as the user base grew, as there was maybe some political pressure and some advertisers were pulling back, then you start getting into these more grounded numbers that are like 30%, 20%, 15%. So if we kind of say, hey, could ChatGPT feel a lot like TikTok of they already have 800 million active users globally. There are probably, let's call it 150 million, active users in North America. Most of the US has kind of tried to use the product once or twice. So it's this massive kind of base to go off of. If we follow that growth trajectory and just literally plug TikTok numbers into ChatGPT, it lands us at around a $20 billion US business by 2030. And again, I've seen like 25, 30 billion estimates for 2030 and other kind of quotes, etc. If we think about that as like a global number, there's no reason to think that can't be the kind of the upper bound of where things are going, right? Here's why I think my personal opinion of one, is that's not going to happen, is a couple of reasons. One, TikTok was like lightning in a bottle. You had this thing kind of land right at a time when younger users were starting to migrate off of Instagram, younger users were starting to migrate off of Meta, in total, Facebook, that they didn't really love the product and kind of were looking for something else. TikTok kind of filled that niche. Number 2, it kind of grew but exploded during COVID because it was like, okay, I'm home. I want content. I scroll through content. TikTok was that perfect kind of panacea right at that right moment, right time. And so the explosive growth that happened was then very quickly followed up with ad growth, right? It wasn't just like ads grew on there and it went from like an ad load of like, 1 per minute to like 500 per minute, right? It was, ads kind of stayed consistent from an ad load perspective, but grew just because their user base exploded. We don't have that same use case with ChatGPT. GPT already has a really large user base. And if we look at kind of the last quarter, Q4, ChatGPT essentially has grown about 6% in terms of monthly active users, quarter over quarter. That's still wildly impressive by most company standards, but you're talking about a company that was growing, 20% at the beginning of the year. And at the same time, Gemini, Claude are all growing pretty fast and kind of taking share. So the idea that like somehow they're going to start really scaling users once ads are introduced, ads never bring people to platforms, right? Like ads help monetize existing clients, but not everyone's not going to go, man, now that they have ads, I can't wait to download this thing. And sure, there'll be like an ad nerd that's curious and it's like, I want to see this firsthand and download the app and use it. But like your average person is not going to be like, ooh, ads, right? So it's not going to kind of accelerate that user growth. Maybe a new kind of ChatGPT, maybe a new model, maybe some sort of, right, innovation in that front can bring users in, but the ads themselves won't. So I think kind of the baseline of like that skyrocketing growth just doesn't make a ton of sense given where their growth is from a user perspective, given kind of the baselines that we see. And so I am more hesitant to kind of peg that at the top line. Not saying that it couldn't happen. We built it. We have the scenario, but it just feels aggressive knowing everything we know of like their current kind of growth trajectory.
And it's not just about users, right? It's about user-generated content and perpetuating that,
Yeah, stickiness of platform, all that.
Exactly. So that's where I see a little bit of differentiation here between TikTok and maybe another platform. We'll talk about that. My experience in ChatGPT is a personal one. It's a one-to-one experience. It's not
It's a great point.
One that has followers, right?
Yeah.
And so there's limits to how many
For sure.
ads I can
Yeah.
potentially be served.
Yeah.
Maybe I become someone who spends more of the hours of my day on ChatGPT, but it's not going to grow at that rate. I'm completely aligned with you on this one, Sean.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense.
So
Scenario 2.
let's keep it moving. Let's talk Meta.
Yeah.
I would say I've had that same feeling in that I want you to talk about the model, but I think you know what I'm already going to say around the kind of growth of users and accounts and kind of the potential there. It's just a little bit of a different ecosystem, but give us your take on Meta and how it compares.
Yeah, for sure. So in the Meta model that we kind of proposed was we looked at Meta post acquisition of Instagram, because that was really when their ad business started to really accelerate. Because like Instagram is a perfect ad platform for so many categories, businesses, advertisers, right? Like it's almost like travel and fashion were made for Instagram in terms of advertising. It took the kind of that high gloss magazine kind of experience that you got from kind of the analog days and replicated it in this beautiful, unique way that's kind of like unique to itself, right? There's kind of one Instagram. So it started to really accelerate ad revenue kind of post Instagram. Not that Facebook was doing poorly, but they kind of had started to plateau by the time that acquisition happened. So that was like our model of like, okay, now that they have the full depth and breadth of all of their ad products, what did it look like? And so the model here is kind of like one of those classic, I'll be honest with you, from a nerd perspective, I always forget if it's left skewed or right skewed, but essentially it's the hump first of a lot of growth and then kind of plateauing out, and then you kind of get this tail. I always mix the two up, so apologies. I'm sure someone will let me know. But that being said, right, is in this model we said,
Sean,
look,
I think this is where I'm supposed to say sound off in the comments for those who are commenting.
Yeah.
Tell
hit
Sean.
Hit us up in the comments or whatever podcast.
Let us know if it's left or right skewed. But
yeah,
I digress.
Yes. Someone somewhere will do the work to tell me I'm wrong, which is fine. But in this case, we wanted to look at this and say, look, if there's that kind of very explosive growth in years 1 and 2, does it start to level off? Because the excitement is gone, the comping larger and larger numbers just makes it harder to kind of put up higher percentages. And so in this scenario, we said by 2030, if it follows a similar trajectory to Meta, we're looking at more like 15.9 billion in terms of ad revenue for the US by the end of 2030. Still incredibly impressive, right? They're at 20 billion-ish today in terms of revenue from like just paid subscribers. So you're talking about a pretty rapid shift in their model of like being largely ad supported by that point. So it's an interesting model. I would actually say that this one feels closer to potential. Again, humble opinion of one. A part of it is that like by the time Meta started to really accelerate advertising, they actually were pretty mature in terms of user base, right? They've kind of shed a little number since then. So they were kind of like peak in this like mid-aughts period in terms of people using the platform. Not that, go ahead. Was that a hand raised?
No.
I was like, are you raising hands? But like in that kind of framing of roughly in that ballpark, not where we don't think the monthly active users for ChatGPT will continue to grow. And again, maybe they're not at maturity, but given some of the slowing of growth, we might be seeing some underlying trends as maybe it is getting to a level of maturity, right? And so this feels like it could be the potential of that quick acceleration and then a little bit of tapering off as kind of more users see those ads, but they're not necessarily growing top line users. And so they have to kind of figure out a different way to like offer new products, kind of like when Instagram, introduced the carousel and things like that. And part of our rationale here on like making it feel like this could be in the direction is like a little bit of what I talked about maturity. I mentioned the 6% growth earlier on kind of monthly active users. The other thing that I would flag is like total percentage of the population using Gen AI has been stubbornly stuck for the last like 18 months or so. So it's kind of hovered in that roughly a third of the world's population has used kind of Gen AI. All of the projections that I'm seeing through 2026 are basically just marginally better. So going from like a 32, 33% to maybe like a 34 or 36% compared to just a couple years ago where it went from like 15 to 25 to 30. And it's now kind of globally seems like it's more like starting to lose a little steam, which again, not even a ChatGPT thing, just Gen AI overall makes me more inclined to think that like this could be a real number.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on an initial, boost and then a plateauing. But my take is ChatGPT is going to see more growth than that, despite
That's
those
fair.
projections. And I think that it's going to come through their hardware product, quite frankly, when that comes out and is integrated. And I think we're going to see more of this, we talked about, or we haven't talked about it on the show, but you and I talked about Apple's decision to have Gemini power Siri 2.0.
I feel like we could do a whole pod on that, but yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be, as it becomes kind of not something that people have to seek out, but something that is just there for people, we're going to see more adoption. So yeah, I think the number feels right, but I don't know if it's going to plateau as much. I think there could be some avenues for growth as we go, but I don't think it's going to be as explosive as TikTok, like you said.
It's a fair point. So maybe you're landing somewhere north of that, 15.9, but south of the 20. Maybe you're at 18, and I'm 14. So it'll be fun. Maybe we could revisit this when we're doing the pod in 4 years. We could, come back to who was right in December of 2030.
We have to. We got to keep ourselves honest, right?
Yeah, we should make a note of that. I don't know where we're going to keep said note, but we'll figure out a place to place that note so we'll remember. I'll send a calendar note for you for 2030.
I love it. So, okay, so we've talked about TikTok. We've talked about Meta. Let's kind of flip the script here a little bit and talk about a different sort of player. Let's talk about Hulu.
Yeah, let's.
And so, you've mentioned that Hulu is unique in how it approached advertising. You've called them they had this first mover advantage. Talk a little bit more about that framing and how Hulu used ads and what their trajectory looked like.
Yeah, for sure. And it's feels a little weird, right? Why are we using Hulu as an example for this unique digital product when they're kind of more of a classic streamer? And I think there's a couple reasons why we had used it as a baseline. Number one, and again, before folks jump in the comment, yes, to be clear, there are other kind of ad-supported kind of streamers that were in the market before Hulu from an AVOD perspective. But Hulu was fairly unique in that they scaled pretty quickly, right? They had a lot of users. They started pretty early on offering the difference between a subscription base where you didn't see ads versus an advertising base where it's you'll see ads, but it's a little cheaper for you to pay to see our content each month. Right? They were pretty unique to that early on. And so that's why I'm kind of claiming that they're a first mover advantage, right? It's the business model plus the tech. Not that others didn't have the tech and were using it before, but they kind of had this sweet sauce of this triangulation of users, business model, tech that kind of made them be unique in the place. Why I think that this could potentially work from an interesting perspective is, number one, in this Hulu model, because we start with the numbers, our top line is by 2030, this thing could be 10 billion. Now, again, where I come in is the 10 billion feels pretty low if today they're starting at kind of almost half that. And so I would hedge to say this is a worst case scenario. I personally think it's going to be more in that meta framing in terms of growth, but that's kind of the idea here, to give the low end, right? So that way everyone has the Goldilocks approach of what you could take from our models. You've got the, too hot, too cold, just right. Hopefully I nailed it in terms of the too hot, too cold, just right. It could be that all of these are too cold or too hot. But that being said, I think kind of in this context, it works because Hulu had tremendous amount of growth in the first 2 years after kind of really scaling their AVOD. But their problem wasn't so much a user thing. It was more of, as other players started to immediately offer their competitive AVOD products, it immediately hampered growth for them. So it was less about users, it was less about their experience, and it was more about fundamentally, it was harder for them to differentiate themselves in the market. When you had Hulu, then you had Peacock, you had Disney Plus, you have Discovery Plus, now you have Netflix, now you have Amazon. So it's harder and harder for them to differentiate, and it becomes more a commodity, right?
Yeah, it became a really crowded space really fast.
Yeah, really fast. Basically, within a 5-year time frame, you went from 2 players to, I don't even know how many to count. It's literally over 10 offering some sort of AVOD. And so that's kind of our model here. And our thinking on this one is, well, Claude, Gemini, none of them have said anything yet, but I suspect that they are going to wait see how this thing plays out, see what it does to usage, sees what it does to their numbers, see what the experience feels like, and then immediately double down and try to figure out what is their own ad model in like years, 1, 2 onward, etc. And so for right now, ChatGPT's got that first mover advantage where they're capturing 100% of Gen AI search budgets. Well, maybe not 100%. I know Rufus has a product, but for all intents and purposes, let's just call it 100%. But by 2027, will they still have 100%? Or are there going to be 3, 4 rival ad type products where that might hamper their growth just naturally, right? And start to kind of slow them down from a trajectory. And that I think is kind of the big outstanding question of like when those are going to go in there. And my hunch is like Gemini can kind of take a wait and see approach because they're also using Google search to help kind of offset some of the costs. So like Google's getting that money in through the door from an advertising perspective, but it might not necessarily be a Gen AI product to start. So that's kind of the baseline that we kind of framed out of like where I think this thing could go. And again, my kind of last take is I'm in the camp that it's more of like that 15 billion, the meta model seems very intuitive to me just in terms of scaling growth, challenges to users, competitive threats, all of those things that like going much higher than that feels like it's always possible, but feels like there's fewer paths to get there in such a short amount of time.
Okay. Well, I think this was really helpful and interesting to provide some historical look backs to kind of take our crystal ball out and see what might happen in the future. And I love your passion, Sean.
Yeah, thanks. It's not something I thought I would have had growing up, but here we are and math helps pay the bills. So why not get excited about it if I'm doing it every day?
I love it. I think that's all we had for today. Anything else you wanted to close out with, Sean?
No, thanks for hanging around this long. I know this was on the longer end of our pods, but hopefully it was informative, helpful, and if not, entertaining.
All right, Sean, that wraps up this episode of Media Monitor.
Terrific. And if you found today's conversation really helpful, tune back next week because we will be delivering insights weekly.
And you can always explore the data behind these discussions at guideline.ai.
Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Media Monitor.